Warm welcome to everybody to the Department of Design Research, Writing, and Criticism. My name is Molly Hines, and I'm the co-chair. And this is the final lecture of our spring lecture series. So, warm welcome. We are thrilled to have had such a great lineup this spring, and we were very honored to have Mark Wasiuta here this evening with us. And I'll introduce Mark properly in just a second. But I just wanted to say that although this is the last formal lecture of our evening series, we're going to have, this is a surprise for the graduate students too, the week of May 2nd, we're going to have a couple of events that I'll open up to our mailing list, roundtable events with our alumni and some editors. So stay tuned for those. And before I go further, I want to thank the team who's helped produce these lectures all through the year, notably Emily Weiner, Frank Bonomo, who's just gone home, Peter Pavlakis, who's helping in the back with our videos this spring semester, and Victor Cruz, who helped with our videos in the fall semester. So huge thank you to you guys for making this possible and allowing these lectures to live on beyond their evenings. And I typically do a quick recap of the program, and I think probably some of our regulars could stand up here and do this for me at this point. So I will keep it short, but we do have some new faces. So just to tell you a little bit about the program, it's a one-year program, a master's program, Master of Arts, and it's broken into 2 semesters, which runs over 9 months. One attractive thing about the program is we do have significant scholarship support from SVA, which makes it fairly affordable. And we are doing a lot of things in the department, but we're also getting out of the department, doing a lot of site visits, exhibition visits, which we did this afternoon, and really getting out into the city. So the big assignment that you see down on the bottom, one of the bottom registers, is our thesis, and I will congratulate our students for turning in their thesis yesterday. So cheers to the students who are with us. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. A quick snapshot of our faculty, many of whom are actually practicing journalists out in the field themselves and come here to teach. And we have a lot of workshop leaders and special instructors who also make appearances. I like to show this slide of all the different kinds of assignments we ask the students to delve into and the types of skills we hope they develop while they're here, and highlight each week to week over the course of the semester, highlight where we are at any given point in time. And the thesis portfolio has certainly been the focus. And if you want to see these skills and all these assignments kind of come to life, I invite you to our culminating event on May 17th that will take place downstairs in the Social Documentary Theater in this same building. And we'll start at 2 o'clock, and the students will be presenting, and there will be lots of opportunities for feedback and questions and dialogue, and over coffee breaks, and with a concluding reception at the end back up here in the department. So if you're not on our mailing list, let me know, and I'll make sure you get an invitation to this. And if you are on our mailing list, look out for your invite. And as I said, these students put in lots of hours and time into this thesis project, which was not just a written thesis, but also a multimedia endeavor that included a podcast and an applied thesis, a proposal for how their thesis could live out in the world. And so congratulations to all of our fantastic MA candidates, soon to be MAs, who handed in their thesis yesterday. I also wanted to announce a fellowship program that we have launched with the Van Allen Institute. They have created a publications program called Van Allen Sessions, which is a multimedia publication in conjunction with the Atlantic magazine. And it involves both writing and also video. And they invited 2 of our students who have a background in architecture to participate as writers and researchers in this. And so congratulations, Alex and Jenny, who will be starting their fellowship this week. And one final announcement. So I know some of you were here for our Phil Patton Memorial Lecture on March 22nd. Phil Patton was a esteemed faculty member who passed away last fall, and a noted design writer and critic. And the Cooper Hewitt put together this great book of his collected writings that launched on that same day. And I have found out from Phil's wife, Kathleen Hamilton, that our department is going to be the recipient of the Phil Patton Coffee Cup Lid Study Collection, which is the fundamental material of one of his most famous articles called Top This, where he took the coffee cup lid and used that as a basis for talking about the whole ecosystem of industrial design and manufacturing in the United States. So be on the lookout for a coffee cup lid exhibition launch soon. Quick note on how to apply to our program. It's pretty straightforward. Transcripts, letter recommendation, a written statement, a writing sample, and a resume. We have possibly a couple of spaces left in our class for next year, but if you or someone you know is interested, have them contact us very soon. They can find out more about the program on our website. As many of you know, lots of great material there from our past students, as well as news and info. Here's a quick snapshot. And our summer program will be starting June 6th, running for 2 weeks. That program is also, we've just gotten in a bunch of applications. I think we may have 1 or 2 spots left in that as well, but most of our same faculty will be leading coursework along with Rob Walker, Mimi Zeiger, and a few other special faculty. Okay, after the lecture, this arrow is pointing you back into the studio to get even more drinks, and I hope you'll join us there to talk to the speaker in person, who is Mark Wasiuta from Columbia. And we're so happy to have Mark here as our culminating speaker of our series, and he has a busy schedule, so we were glad to be able to snag him. And in addition to teaching at GSAPP, he is director of exhibitions, director of collecting architecture territories, and director of the MS degree program in critical, curatorial, and conceptual practices in architecture. And in addition, he is a partner in the Design and Research Office, International House of Architecture. Mark is co-editor and co-author of Dan Graham's New Jersey, and his forthcoming publications include Environments and Counter-Environments, Experimental Media in Italy, The New Domestic Landscape, Documentary Remains, and Collecting Architecture Territories. And he has a current exhibition called Every Building in Baghdad, the Rifat Chatterjee Archives at the, I should have asked you, Archives at the Arab Image Foundation. And recent past exhibitions include La Fine del Mondo at the 14th Architectural Exhibition at the Venice Biennale, Invention at the 31st Sao Paulo Art Biennial, D'Este Fashion Collection 1-8 at the Benaki Museum in Athens, Information Fallout, Buckminster Fuller's World Game, and Les Levine Biotech Rehearsals 1967 to 1973 at the Arthur Ross Architecture Gallery. But tonight he'll be talking about one of his exhibitions called Environmental Communications Contact High, which originated at Columbia, but then also was shown at the Chicago Architecture Biennial last fall, which is where I saw it for the first time, and I was completely captivated and knew immediately that I wanted Mark to come talk about it here at the program. And I think it's an extremely fitting culmination to our semester as it touches research writing and criticism, both from the curator Mark's perspective and his approach to the exhibition, but also in terms of his subject and how the Media Collective Environmental Communications worked, developing and disseminating a critical point of view on architecture and design education. So, without further ado, Mark, please come tell us more. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks for you all coming out. I know it's an insane time in the semester for everyone, and congratulations to everyone who's just submitted their thesis. as Molly pointed out, I'm going to be talking about this exhibition that was shown at the Chicago Architecture Biennial, Environmental Communications Contact High. I'm going to refer to them as EC here, so just so you know what I'm saying. And as Molly pointed out, just to place this in context, this exhibition fits into a series of projects that I've been working on as, just give you some sense of what this looks like, a series of projects that I've been working on at Columbia and at other venues and biennials and within the kind of exhibition circuit. It belongs to a series of research exhibitions that are focused on archives, architectural archives and related archives, of under-examined projects from the post-war era primarily, and especially those that seem to offer a degree of resistance to some of our field architecture's more dominant narratives. And so in this sense, the work that we do at Columbia, and at least the work that I pursue, tries to differ from work that you might see at other institutions that have a mandate to consolidate histories and to claim disciplinary territories. This instead is a type of practice touched by the last decades of critical exhibitions histories and exhibition scholarship. And I would say that ours is maybe a more particular approach and surgical as it cuts into histories and archives of experimental practices. I think it might also help to point out that this belongs to a series of projects that has a kind of thematic unity. And this is an attempt to produce an episodic history of architecture's post-war environmental practices and experiments. And one thing that maybe some of you who are interested in thinking about and writing through exhibitions we might return to this later. There's something about this idea of finding a thematic strain across a series of exhibitions that has become a kind of interesting conceptual gambit for me, in that it tries to tie together projects that are divorced in time, but they have a way of infiltrating each other and interfering with each other. And I think because I've been able to manage a series of exhibitions at Columbia and elsewhere, this has produced something like a coherent set of themes and tropes that occur over time. Interesting. Oh, sorry, I hadn't realized what I'd done here. And as Molly pointed out, just to give you some sense of what these projects are, this is the exhibition that's up now at Columbia, Every Building in Baghdad, the Rifat Chatterjee archives of the Arab Image Foundation. And it's an incredibly interesting set of documents that come from this collection in Beirut, the Arab Image Foundation, devoted to collecting images of the Arab world, and especially images that show something about the conditions of threat in the Arab world in the last 20 or 30 years. But the exhibition is focused on the work of an Iraqi architect, Rifat Chatterjee, who was active from the 50s to the 70s, eventually jailed by Saddam Hussein's predecessor, released from Abu Ghraib prison by Saddam Hussein, and then left the country. But during this 50 to 70 years, he produced an incredibly interesting body of work in which he tried to distance Iraqi architecture from both international modernism, but also something that was known as pan-Arabism in the region, and tried to attach his work to the local context. But at the same time, it was governed by this sense of dread because of the myriad forms of cultural and physical violence in Iraq in that period. And so the exhibition is a kind of lament, in a sense, about the life and architecture in Baghdad and its relationship to all of the forms of cultural violence that we're all too familiar with in the region now. This is the image, an image of an exhibition on Les Levine biotech rehearsals. I don't know if you know Les Levine, an incredibly important artist from the same period, who was once compared to Andy Warhol over a period of 1 year in 1969, produced 25 different exhibitions, incredibly prolific, but let's say has dropped from view. But a kind of interesting figure who worked on new technologies, early video practices, and somebody that Jack Burnham once described as the most authentic proponent of something he called the systems aesthetic in the late 1960s. just to give you a sense of our own systems aesthetic at Columbia. Buckminster Fuller's World Game, Information Fallout, an exhibition on Buckminster Fuller's World Game. Again, a kind of important and pivotal project for Fuller, but not one well-known. A project in which he tries to organize, consolidate the world's global resources. Or a project like this, Environments and Counter-Environments, which was an exhibition looking at the 1972 famous exhibition by Emilio Ambaz at the Museum of Modern Art, Italy, the New Domestic Landscape, and in particular looking at the video experiments that he asked the architects in 1972 to perform. And this is the exhibition I'm going to talk about tonight, here in its iteration at Columbia. But the second form of practice, which I have to point out, is this collaboration International House of Architecture with my collaborators Marco Sánchez and Adam Bandler, and it's this project that comes out of that collaboration. It's a project that in some ways mirrors what I've been doing at Columbia. We have been attempting to assemble something we call the Environmental Archive of Los Angeles, and we're working on a book project around something that we call Los Angeles's air urbanism. And it was through this attempt to look at what the environmental history of Los Angeles was, what that meant, that this project emerged. And so the initial research into environmental communications came from that project. But this is the state in which we found the so-called EC archives. And this was in a garage in Santa Monica. And this is actually an extremely well-ordered version of the archive. And I show you this only to point out that this is a project, and projects like this often take years, not only assembling the material, but also working through how to position the material, especially for a group like this in which there has been no real substantial reception. The last time anybody wrote about environmental communications was probably 1976. And so this image points to something of the labor, but also to the long time span. But also I think it points to the fact that the exhibitions projects that I work on tend not to be culminations of research. They tend to be the first stages, the first attempts to formalize some thoughts around a project. All right, so hopefully that gives you a context. But from among the hundreds of files and thousands of images that I found in that garage with my collaborator, Mark Sánchez, and all the other materials we combed through, I've extracted this modest manila folder to begin, and it was found lodged within those banks of filing cabinets that contain a vast compendium of similar records. The document we're looking at, on the right side of the folder, a purchase order from 1970 reads, 50 slide sets entitled Human Territoriality in the City. It was ordered by the Princeton School of Architecture. The shipping instructions indicate that the slide set should be sent to the attention of Robert L. Geddes, then dean of the school. And on the surface, this dry administrative record is perhaps not the most compelling image to speak of experimental practices of the 1970s. The slide set itself promises even less visual excitement, marked as it is by its overtly academic title and its coded reference to behavioral and environmental psychology, the disciplines through which architecture and environmental design borrow most directly an interest in territoriality in the 1970s. So only if somehow are we able to collapse the distance between the Princeton campus and the outer reaches of the continent on the West Coast, in New Venice, as the purchase order reads, I'm not sure where they get that from, with the dissonance and complicated relationship between the academic posture of the slide set and the more hallucinatory countercultural character of the architecture and media collective Environmental Communications, the group producing and supplying the slides, have been rendered legible. And so I'm introducing environmental communications through figures of academic probity, such as Dean Geddes, represented here, through locations of unassailable pedagogical fortitude, such as arguably was Princeton in 1970, and through documents such as this purchase order to register some of the complexities and tensions that appear within the work of EC. These tensions also characterize architecture's environmental thought during the 1970s and can be traced in various attempts to deploy, exploit, render, apply environment to architecture more generally during this period. But I'm also interested in asking about the survival of documents such as this, and in considering how it is a form of evidence for architecture, how it can be read or understood, as well as an environmental document, whatever that might mean, and to ask what can be revealed about experimental disciplinary formations and their limits through a record such as this. You all know that looking at sales receipts and other administrative records is hardly a shocking, innovative strategy. Indeed, this would be entirely conventional within many forms of history. Yet in this case, for the project of EC, the sales record is not only an artifact that reveals a form of monetary exchange, and that attests to perhaps a surprising countercultural commercial practice, or that further hints at the curious mutation of images through EC slide sets into a new type of environmental commodity, or that tells us something of the desirability and marketability of terms such as human territoriality for architecture of this period. But it is also evidence that at some factual, material, administrative, and verifiable level, the most audacious and subversive strategy conceived by EC, amidst the clamor and riot of Venice, California, had successively wafted from the West Coast to the East and had penetrated its teaching institutions, apparatuses, and pedagogies. So just to point out that that slide set from Princeton is one of tens of thousands of such documents connecting EC to the ETH, Playboy, the CIA, Domus, etc. And so through these records, a diagram of the institutional capillaries through which EC's images circulated can be assembled. Formed by a group of young architects, photographers, and psychologists, and working in Venice, the hub of Southern California's counterculture, environmental communications honed an image practice they described as environmental photography. This technique entailed a process of sensitizing oneself to the spatial, mediatic, and social conditions that the group documented in Tokyo, the American Southwest, and most often Los Angeles. It allowed them, they believed, to track and render visibly normally imperceptible environmental transformations, and to alter what they saw as an environmental resistance to images. EC wagered that a new visual syntax, one adequate to the complexity of the late 20th century city, could be formed by a novel media practice that aimed to be both analytical and experimental. They were influenced by Los Angeles' conceptual photography movement through figures such as Ed Ruscha, who was represented here in one of their pamphlets, John Baldessari, and with close ties to experimental groups such as San Francisco's Ant Farm, and you see something of their relationship in these letter exchanges, and enmeshed in a network of architectural offices and artist groups in Southern California and beyond. And this is documents of their relationship to the Italian radical group Superstudio. And EC understood themselves as a similar type of exploratory collective, often testing new definitions of their identity against this countercultural design and art network. They describe themselves as a matrix, a system and an experience that documents, researches, and communicates the relationship between man and environment, and claimed that through environmental photography, they would develop what they called systems of perception. The group eventually shot tens of thousands of 35mm slides, forming a vast visual taxonomy of Southern California's urban and social geography. To give you a sense of some of their imagery. The group's core members, Roger Webster, David Greenberg, Ted Tokyo Tanaka, and Bernard Perloff, positioned themselves in their Windward Avenue studio, both physically and methodologically far, not only from the East Coast schools such as Princeton, Yale, Harvard, and Penn, but also from the seminar rooms and lecture halls of the architecture schools of their period closer to home in California and Los Angeles. Nonetheless, the state of architectural education during the late 1960s through the 70s, an assessment of new forces putting pressure on cities and on architecture, and the possibility of a mediatized counter-pedagogy conceived and shaped at a distance from the university dominated their practice and saturated their relationship to the discipline. These are images of what the inside of the studio looked like, images of the boys, because, very self-consciously figured as boys. In the studio. This is how the slides were distributed through these slide boxes. But the slides were compiled into thematic sets with titles such as This, Human Territoriality in the City, Ultimate Crisis, Urban Crowd Behavior, etc. Their slides were sold via the Environmental Communications catalog to museums and cultural institutions, booklets. These are more images from the early catalogs to slightly later catalogs, and because you're all design scholars, you can see something in the shift of the aesthetic, still trying to figure out what it would be to represent a countercultural aesthetic to the world, and what that mode of communication is. So booklets printed to accompany the slides mimicked a format familiar to audiovisual education, offering instructive descriptions of each slide, as you read here, and brief essays that served as condensed primers on architecture's environmental thought. The group soon expanded its recording practices to encompass photographic, portapack video shoots from airplanes, helicopters, and blimps. This is one of them in an aerial survey blimp ride over Los Angeles, with their recording apparatus surrounding them. And they extended the scope of action at the Windward Avenue studio to include film screenings, electronic media festivals, and Venice Beach happenings. Various strata of the EC recording process, from aerial surveys to drive-by imagery, reveal various attributes of the group's image taxonomies. Airborne photography identified urban and atmospheric patterns in shots such as this, serial photographs of movement, people, objects on the ground, while other photographs showed serial movements of people and objects on the ground, separated by minute differentiations, and they relied on a dense accumulation of images to produce EC's total environmental documentation. Just some examples from a series called COPS. And so through their slide catalogs and this heteroclite body of work, they became interpreters and purveyors of new architectural and environmental trends, and they assembled a mass inventory of images to counter the buildings, monuments, and histories that governed architecture and its teaching institutions. And we'll come back to that point later. The catalog and distribution practices were both a mechanism for sales and a central theoretical operation. They wanted to exploit the anxiety and ambiguity of architecture's relationship to environment, as well as environmental design's uncertain attempts to represent the complexity of the post-war city. The group calculated that their slide sets would infiltrate schools with images that would figure and define the elusive qualities of this architectural environment. But more subversively, ET intended to disturb the conventional categorization of architecture into periods, movements, discrete monuments, and artifacts through the distribution of seemingly alien or featureless images bereft of conventional architectural distinction. Environment and communications would displace the canon of architectural monuments and objects. To this end, their slide series addressed ecological issues and other topics conventionally excluded from architectural teaching. Looking at the collection of slide series pamphlets and interpretive texts, one is struck by the group's canny ability to also compose an alternative canon, or rather to assemble a group of projects we can now read as a canon of alternative practices from the 70s, across the range of sets devoted to inflatables, communes of the Southwest. Just to give you an example here. Nomadic truck architecture, Palo Solare, commercial strip architecture of Los Angeles. Not to mention their focus on groups such as Ant Farm and Super Studio, for whom they served as distributors, an encyclopedia of mediatic, cybernetic experiments, desert vernaculars, pop strategies, as well as documents of the city as a site of social interaction comes into focus slide by slide. Just to give you a sense of some of their slide series and their pamphlets. Through an intellectual sympathy with media theorist Marshall McLuhan, hardly a theoretical stance that would come as a surprise, and with a close personal association, Marshall McLuhan's daughter Mary worked with the group for a period in the 1970s. EC tested ideas for a collaboration on the project that would eventually appear without EC as the last of McLuhan's publications, The City as Classroom. Despite its failure, the McLuhan collaboration in particular signals a critical aspect of the EC project. By infiltrating slide libraries and new audiovisual pedagogies with their environmental taxonomies, EC sought to target institutional knowledge while forming a relationship between the terrain of the city and the interior spaces of architectural institutions. In this sense, EC directed its photographs, films, and video reels at the erosion of boundaries among sites of architectural practice. In a McLuhanian shift, EC postulated that the slide library was the emerging center of institutional pedagogical power, and they believed that by altering this, the university's image cortex, as they described it, they would transform pedagogy and spark a revolution in student consciousness. So I want to pause here for a moment at the rather stunning formulation of the university slide library of all improbable places as the site of intellectual, perceptual, and social revolution, and to rehearse the main precepts of the Environmental Communications Project. I think we can summarize their decade-long body of work as organized around 5 major insights that move from those that are more obvious to those that have an increasing degree of originality and that help to distinguish their practice and reveal some of the stakes of the environmental education project with which their work is entwined. Oops. We seem to be missing an image. That's all right. The first insight is that as architects, photographers, and psychologists, the group could form around a practice of architecture that is primarily based in producing media. This is to say that architecture is conceived as a media practice for EC. And this is what I mean. This is hardly an original proposition in 1970. If you think of groups like Super Studio or Ant Farm that are collaborating with EC, or people like Ugo La Pietra, or even more conventionally, people like Venturi Scott Brown, we understand that architecture in 1970 is thinking through comprehensively its relationship to media. But their second insight is already slightly more polemical, and that this is based on the notion that through architecture's relationship to environment, and specifically through the disciplinary alteration of architecture schools to colleges of environmental design, following the shift at UC Berkeley in 1959, which famously became the first college of environmental design in America, that there was not only a definitional and disciplinary instability performed by and through environmental incursions into and expansions of architecture, but that more problematically, there was a dearth of images of environment for architecture. The claim is that that architecture's environmental practice, through its close association with the social sciences, had assembled a technical, diagrammatic, tabular form of environmental evaluation, social interaction, and urban diagnoses that failed to compose into a recognizable and communicable form of environmental imagery. Their next observation was that through techniques of environmental photography, they would be able to produce this type of image. Yet more important for them is that this image, rather than being merely descriptive or diagnostic, would be a behavioral modifier. This is to say that the image would carry with it clues of how to alter perception of the city, architecture, and the urban environment, and would also alter forms of cognition and behavior outside of the scene of image reception. The projected slide would be a compressed, image-based kernel of social action. The fourth insight is that the practice could evolve to entail a more complex process of documentation, production, and dissemination, and that through the legitimation offered in the early 1970s by other countercultural dissemination projects, such as a Whole Earth Catalog, EC could use the catalog as a mechanism of distribution. Learning from the capacity of the Whole Earth Catalog to aggregate generational desires, EC pitched its print identity as a device for sales and as a technique to assemble a collective of sympathetic, mediatically attuned practitioners formed around concerns for the environment and experimental architecture. Yet the catalog was also a masking system that would allow the group to position itself as a business endeavor that could perform institutionally and pedagogically alongside other various sales agencies and enterprises that supplied the wave of investment in audio-visual instruction and teaching methods from elementary schools to universities. EC understood that the audio-visual had become the signifier of advanced instruction and cognition, supported as it was by various grants, government agencies, and educational boards, and has had been done by the Open University in England or proposed throughout American academia. For example, the directors of the Children's Television Workshop, the group that directed the TV show Sesame Street, suggested that basic concepts of number and shape taught through the television environment would close the gap between disadvantaged and middle-class children. Or to cite another example, in his outline for the article on the role of new technology in the ghetto, Billy Kluver, founder of the enterprise Experiments in Art and Technology, argues that the provision of local TV antenna, signal amplifiers, and a network of closed-circuit televisions with a camera in each apartment would lead to new forms of education and literacy, as well as to accelerated social and technical involvement. Such involvement, Kluver argued, would allow the street intelligentsia, his term, to be saved from deterioration and would provide an alternative to what he labels as political extremism. Hence, the catalogs, whatever else they allow us to glimpse about the content approach and environmental taxonomies of the group, also point to a peculiar site of collision between the emergence of experimental media practices, the potentially radical reformulation of environment and architecture as mediatized and mediatic, and a more normative, administrative, educational, audiovisual enterprise that begins to look to new territories and new spaces of instruction in the early 1970s, and to make media communicational and pedagogical in the sense of direct, unimpeded transfer of information, instruction, and knowledge. But the fifth and most subversive insight, the one that absorbs and overrides the logic of the others, is that given this investment in audiovisual instruction in America, educational policy generally, and within architectural schools specifically, the status of the slide library was ascendant and at the same time vulnerable. This meant that an operation of strategic interruption or contamination could penetrate the university via this space of dense informational accumulation that was both the least defended and potentially the most potent site within the schools. And these weak defenses were in part a product of the weak, inconsistent catalogs and taxonomies of slide libraries. The slide library literature, for those of you interested, of the late 60s and early 70s, including Betty Jo Irvine's classic 1974 compendium, Slide Libraries, illuminates the problem of image classification. Most slide libraries of the era used multiple and incoherent systems of classification, from subjective image to accession date to media to artist or architect. The critical issue, similar to that faced by EC, was how to identify and describe similarities among images. What was the logic of image organization and association? Just to give you a sense of how improbable this is as a site of revolution, the RISD Slide Library, circa 1969, the Yale Slide Library, but here the dream space of all other slide libraries of the period, the Dallas Museum of Art, much closer to a Kubrick stage set than the Yale Slide Library. And so the group wasn't especially theoretically inclined. They produced almost no writing other than their slide set descriptions and their pamphlets and catalogs. But one exception was a text on education and media. And through this text, we see EC strategizing the mediatic failure of the university and how this would allow them to enter, alter, and territorialize the slide library through a new type of environmental image. And in part, this insertion would be made possible, they thought, by what they read as the taxonomic frailty of the existing slide library and by the sly force of their own taxonomies. As the slides are sold to the university library, then two organizational regimes and systems of images come into contact, and EC predicted a triumphant victory. But what this victory might look like was not absolutely clear, but in part, it would entail the dismantling of an existing monument-oriented pedagogy and the cognitive retooling of students or learners, in EC's idiom, that would allow them to, what they claimed would be to directly experience the environment. As opposed to images that teach formal content, EC's claim was that their images would train viewers to encounter the environment creatively and, in their words, as it is. Sorry, this slide is out of place. That's the Ugo La Pietra image. I want to pause again and explain something more about the EC image practice. It is organized into two forms of photography series, these that encounter the city as it is, naturally. That was at some level the result of the group's perceptual cognitive training as it practiced what they called environmental photography. And this approach delivered the massive image taxonomy that forms the record of this increasingly automatic image collection. And so just to give you a sense of some of these images, this comes from taxonomy airplanes. And again, these are extracted from hundreds of images, freeways, city sex, men, city seniors, the kind of you see their kind of taxonomic ambitions. And then there's a second set of images that were extracted from those taxonomies and developed around specific themes that would be sold and distributed. And so you have things like the survey of inflatables, surveys on domes, nomadic truckitecture, and then groups like this, human territoriality in the city. And it's a set like this that emerges more organically from the group's early and primary conceptual interest in documenting and assessing social, environmental interaction. And so within the exhibition, at least as it appeared at Chicago, these two sets of images face off. On one hand, we have those sets of images which are their vast image taxonomy of everyday life within the city, Los Angeles, Tokyo, and elsewhere, and the others that are the thematic image sets. And that opposition organizes all of the other documents in the exhibition, those that are related to how they conceive of environmental photography, how they conceive of the cognitive retooling in relationship to the city, and then those images that explain something, how they package that notion of environmental psychology, how they try to produce the slide as that kernel of social action as they sell it to cultural institutions around the world. So just to return to the slide library with these sets and distinct photo practices in mind, the group produced one piece of writing called EC Material, an Educational Breakthrough, that offers a fairly precise compaction of their strategy. In this text, they argue that the EC images provide content of what is normally invisible in the classroom. The images allow cross-fertilization among disciplines with environment as a common ground. With the EC images, as opposed to others, information is current, there's no time lag. And with EC, learning is decentralized and self-programming. And this last point about learning being decentralized and self-programming registers something about the curious Klein bottle topology of EC's environmental thought. First, seeing the environment as it is had to be taught. That's what their slides are for, to produce a direct, unmediated relationship to the environment taught through a mediatic enterprise. This learning process was the extension of EC's own perceptual development through environmental photography, now transmitted to students via images. Where this leads, finally, is to a networked, decentralized educational system that may begin within the slide library or the scene of image reception within the school, but that ultimately ends outside the university. As ever indebted to McLuhan, and in this case particularly to his 1973 lecture at the University of Southern California, EC borrows McLuhan's invocation of Ivan Illich's famous text, Deschooling, as an imperative to destructure pedagogical institutions. McLuhan argues that both inside and outside of the school, language appears as a vast data bank organized by the impressions and inflections of millions of people, and that in the 1970s, we were collectively attempting to transfer this language to electronic databases. Such a switch from language as a site of institutional and cultural formation to one of immediate electronic encounter that bypasses the biases of inherited pedagogies became the model for EC. They began to consider their own slides and images as an embodiment of an autonomous educational apparatus, and their slides as a massive operational environmental database akin to McLuhan's electronic language storehouse. Yet I think it's also worth paying a little more attention to the first of the EC points. It states their slides provide content of what is normally invisible in the classroom. And so one reading of this point is that the image of Southwest communes or custom cars were not often part of first-year architectural history courses, so the EC image database radically opens and expands the structure and possibilities of the field. Images of the EC database inside their studio and them working it. But another reading of this invisibility is through the form of invisibility already encoded within environmental thought and environmental design discourse of the 60s and 70s. And that, again, to refer to McLuhan, is summarized by his text, The Invisible Environment, or through his aphorism here, that when advertising becomes so environmental as to be unperceived, that is when it's doing most of its work. McLuhan's claim introduces two important characterizations of post-war environments, which is that they proliferate in and through communications, and they simultaneously disengage from perception. The environment and communications, then, the twin terms of the group's name, are post-war cybernetic synonyms, both inflected by the social, the electronic, and the informational, as well as by such a distancing from perception. So environment from the early 70s is both ubiquitous but often invisible, theoretically densely articulated and yet elusive. It's a term or a condensation of effects that penetrated architecture to the point of disciplinary redefinition, and yet how we described it, located it, or knew it was vexingly ambiguous. Moreover, clinging to the term was an anxiety around environmental conditioning. Through its invisibility, environments were not only potentially saturated with toxins, but also with messages and controls that would operate on and condition us. They were plenums of communicational imperatives. So when EC provides an image of what is normally invisible, on one hand, they rely on the capacity of their image to deliver a form of counter-control, counter-education, and counterculture. Yet on the other hand, EC never fully escapes the problem they set to resolve. It is only when we accept environment as structured by object spaces and pollutants that the image of environment appears easily possible and legible. However, from the earliest experiments with, say, urban crowd behavior, we see EC grappling with a more complex environmental image dilemma. At one level, this problem was discursive and definitional. Environment designated ecological issues, but also an engagement with the social sciences and with cybernetics, biological and urban growth theories. The term captured anything from Halperin's experiments in environment to Negroponte's ethical robots. These are, for those of you who aren't architects, these are two figures in architecture of the period. Ethical robots as a form of environmental humanism. Similarly, although EC's photographs would proliferate into a vast collection of environmental photography, their effect remains curiously enigmatic. It's often a challenge to understand precisely what individual images communicate and how the environment is encoded in the slide series. The slides both retain and rely on the indeterminacy of their environmental object, even as they aim to remedy its invisibility. As a result, the environmental photography project oscillates between the demands of sharper definition and the fugitive qualities of its subject. However, this seemingly absent environmental subject is also an attempt at an objective image of social interaction. What is most environmental in these images is the invisible territory of communicative exchange, behavioral conditioning, and learning, as well as the extension of architecture, the city, and the image into some other environmental register of relationships. Some of you may know literary theorist Eva Horn, who argues that within media studies, the notion of medium reduces to a fragile and even ephemeral state of what she calls in-betweenness, as much a moment of separation as of mediation, a moment of structuring and encoding, and thus the creation of order, but also the source of disruption and noise. I think everybody who thinks about media understands that dichotomy. For EC, environment similarly describes a form of interconnection or a fragile, barely discernible set of relations or interactions. The inventory of slides, of images of environmental communication is then an attempt to itemize and categorize this ever-expanding and fluid system of interaction through singular events, moments, and postures. The list, the taxonomy, the series becomes the registration of this simultaneous isolation and the expansive totality of relations. In an absolute sense, it's the notion of the environmental database derived from the reading of McLuhan. As the slides enter the slide library, they are also, as Horn suggests about media in general, a moment of environmental structuring and encoding, as well as a form of potential disruption, contamination, interruption. But this is fitting, since some form of interruption is exactly what EC hoped to accomplish within the courses and pedagogies of the schools and within the perceptual conditioning of the students. This disruption emerges when clearly defined epochs, movements, and objects encounter the images of such as this and of communication, environment, and behavior. And so if there's a form of contact high, a disorienting contamination that appears when these two image systems encounter one another, in which, say, Le Corbusier's Ville Savoie is suddenly adjacent to the slide series Hardcore LA, there is also an interruptive separation. If the uncertain image of social interaction that recurs through EC's body of work is an attempt to visualize the social structure of environmental control, these images also operate on or make contingent the definitional imagistic certainty of the other slides in the existing architectural image bank. They are inserted conceptually and possibly physically between the other slides, buildings, monuments, and artifacts to open up a gap within the library structure. If the EC images issue a challenge to static forms of architecture and the production of knowledge that labels and classifies them, they also issue a challenge to the neutrality of the slide format, the communication system that constitutes the city, its behaviors, and its environment that are the subject or the content of the slides, force a reflection on the status of the slide's own communicative effects, spaces, and territories. At their sharpest, the EC slides are not only alternative histories or techniques for enhanced environmental perception, or media with architecture and environment as their subject, they are also theoretical mediatic intrusions into architecture and into the space of architectural educational media that are the least observed and analyzed. Or put slightly differently, there is a more corrosive effect of EC's images and systems of perception. Their massive investment in imaging environment not only displaces or exposes the limits, as it were, of the existing canons, forms, and buildings, it also displaces the communicative certainty of the image itself and the space of the slide library. The images expand architectural environmentally, but also compel us to ask what is really being transmitted within the scene of mediatized pedagogies. No different in this regard from many similar explorations of the 1970s, theirs was a tragically frustrated project. Despite its sales successes and a degree of institutional infiltration through images such as this, despite their fleet of EC media vehicles, one of their media vans, despite patents for their educational services related to man's environment, despite their contracts with celebrated artists, architects, and writers, despite their celebrity visitors, Shiplord of Ant Farm on the left, Rainer Banham, architectural historian on the right, despite their endless group therapy sessions, despite the forms of advertising that proliferate around their practice in the city, the institutions and pedagogies they targeted hardly failed, and the image of expanded practices and experimental media gave way to a wide array of retreats and retrenchments through the 1970s and 80s, as we well know. Although their compendium of countercultural design and their investment in precise mechanisms of social communication clearly belong to another era's concerns, the project remains uncannily familiar to us in part through the all too obvious associations with current systems of image collection, proliferation, circulation, and of contemporary conceptions of environmental data and all its implications. Yet these images also have a compelling outmoded fragility. EC's environmental database is a system of perception that is formed not only by the perceptual conditioning of the group, but also by the chemicals, processes, and surfaces of the notoriously unstable slide medium. Their waning color and eroding image clarity point to a triple frailty or demise allegorized and inscribed in this slide archaeology. That of the photographs themselves, this frailty, that of the disruptive counter-pedagogy, that frailty, and that of the alternative environmental logics encoded in their image database. So just to close, I'll return to the exhibition, just to point out that the challenge of this project is to devise a mode of encounter with the material and following EC strategy to ask what can be made visible of their practice, of the environment of the early 1970s, and its implications for architecture and education. But it is also an attempt to locate and suggest relations among the documents. In part, it's to show the slides themselves, as you see here, emphatically as material artifacts and not as image projections, to show the slides themselves related to the records and other documents, and how that network of images, documents, circulations, and systems of mediatic penetration form into the complex system of perception that EC attempted to theorize and enact. Thank you.
I started to think about the moment we're in now, which I think might be analogous to some of these AV shifts that were happening in higher education, where right now there's kind of this anxiety in academic institutions around teaching programming skills. And I'm actually seeing a lot of kind of small, mostly artist-driven groups creating tools around teaching programming that are also kind of deeply embedded with some like strong political and philosophical biases that are largely illegible to the institutions that are adopting the tools. I mean, so I wonder, like, is that why this project could go as far as it could, because there was like a paucity of options in terms of getting slides of stuff at all, and thus the institutions had to deal with whatever weird stuff these groups were serving up? Am I understanding that right, or like what, you know?
Well, I think there are a few parts to that question, but the...
Sorry, yeah, it wasn't
No. I don't think that's why institutions bought them. There were many slide distribution companies in the 60s and 70s, but as you can imagine, fairly conventional. They fed the appetite of existing architectural history courses, and so you would get, Gothic cathedrals, or you would get, Le Corbusier's oeuvre, something like that. And even the more interesting ones somehow fit within the logic of fairly banal architectural histories. But at the same time, you had a lot of radical practices, and you had a lot of teachers. It's not like this mode of thought was unknown to schools. It's not like people weren't paying attention to different types of practices. And it's not as though they didn't know at some level what Superstudio was doing, but most of that information was circulated through journals like AD or Domus in the early 70s. And that's what fed the desire for information about new practices. And so they understood that somehow, even at the most superficial level, just funneling images from those experimental practices into schools would produce some type of desire. But also what came with that, I think, as I was trying to explain, was an attempt to piggyback on architecture's obsession with environment in the 70s. And I think, because I work on this obsessively, I understand what that means, but you might not. But to see a dean of Princeton School of Architecture ordering the slide set Human Territoriality in the City tells you something about what that means. I mean, this is obviously one of the more established and respected architecture schools in the country. And so this reveals that it was infiltrating the school. But that also there was a receptive audience. And so they tried to figure out how to, at one level, pose as academic, use the desire for radical projects, but also within that to deliver what they thought was a much more radical project than those of the architects they were working with. The question about what's happening in schools now and who is not aware of that and its effects, I think that's true. I don't know about programming, but you certainly see through ventures like online teaching and online lecture courses, an attempt to mediatize education. And it usually follows a very similar argument to the ones that were made in the 60s and 70s, that somehow media is immediate, meaning that it denies everything we know about media theory, but in its educational pedagogical mode, audiovisual education offered the notion that somehow transmission of knowledge would be direct and more efficient and optimized. And so that in part is what I was trying to argue, is that they also understood the desire around audiovisual education and what that had produced, but they tried to channel that desire toward other directions, toward types of images that refused that notion of immediate transmission of information and knowledge.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for a wonderful talk. That was great. I just wanted to ask about I'm seeing quite a few parallels with the development of technology and maybe, it's a little bit earlier than EC, but like aerial photography and those sorts of communications technology with the developments today with, say, drones and photography and the relation to urban planning and urbanism and documentation and even ecology and conservation. So I was wondering, from your perspective, what do you think we might be able to learn from EC, whether it's sort of limitations or risks of the method of recording, and by its sort of implication, recording and having some sort of value judgment? What can we learn from that to the new emergent technologies today?
I see. Well, I think EC would be pleased to think that somehow they could posture as anything like an official image collecting enterprise. Spy satellite photography was already well advanced by the late 1950s. There were, for the Fuller project, I was looking at the way in which spy satellites are designed and formed and release their images. There was one of the earliest ones with flight paths over the Soviet Union had a one-year supply of film on a massive reel, and it would shoot the photographs, it would cut it, and it would drop it to be picked up by an airplane that would hook it. It would drop in a parachute and be picked up by an airplane. And so EC in a blimp over Los Angeles is a kind of sad echo of the technological sophistication that was already in place in the late 1950s. But I think you're right. There's just something about the aerial image that seems to borrow that rhetoric of military or paragovernmental authority. And I think in part they were trying to produce that. I'm not sure they were fully in control of that rhetoric, but it's also true that those images appear within architectural texts as early as the 1920s and 30s. The aerial image becomes an incredibly important reference, is used by different types of planning agencies and urban development schemes. And so at some level they were trying to understand that because they were interested in urban patterns, whatever that might mean. I think they were more interested at, let's say, the communicational patterns and how that could be revealed. There's a kind of impossibility to that project, which I was trying to point to. But I think they were also interested in how other patterns of movement and circulation could be shown through aerial images. But the way that relates to contemporary image databases, I'm not exactly sure, except insofar as anybody who does it successfully now has somehow cracked the problem of how to associate an image to another. I mean, I think you could probably, if you looked at all of the Silicon Valley startups and businesses organized around images, you would find that this is what they're trying to do. Through image search algorithms, through social network information extraction, they're trying to understand what can be revealed about similarities between images, and whether that's formal similarities, whether that's subjects and objects, whether that is historical dating. That seems to be like the primary informational imperative for these groups. And so at some weird analog level, this is what EC was trying to do as well. But you've seen their database. Hundreds of thousands of images, a few guys sitting around in Venice Beach and using whatever they can to help them understand the environmental image, and a team of really smart women who worked for them and did most of the intelligent work of the cataloging and organizing. There's a really shocking division of labor within that. But even the intelligence of those women, I don't think, came close to producing anything like a manual for how that structure of images could be used by anyone else.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, thank you. Amazing talk. And speaking of teams, I'm super interested in the facet of their kind of documentation process, but also the facet of their business, which, I mean, you showed so many amazing pieces of design communication, and you talked a little bit about kind of the evolution of that, but I'm curious, like, who was doing that and what role did it play in their success?
Which architects were working on communications, do you mean?
The actual layouts of their documents.
Their documents, yeah.
The branding, their identity, the graphic design, it was just
amazing,
incredible,
right?
yeah.
And you know, I went through them very quickly, but you also see the evolution from early informal zine-like graphics to something that becomes more formalized. And it's hard to know what's going on, because the first ones are more compelling to me anyway, and seem like evidence of a stronger graphic mind. But as they become larger, as they become printed in color, as they become more expensive, as they become more slick, it's hard to know whether the experimental project is waning and the sales project is growing, or whether they have just learned that there's something about the graphic registration that has to distance itself from the kind of Bay Area graphics of the 70s into another mode of presentation that will be more easily received. So I think the graphics is, you're entirely right, that's at the heart of it, and how they think about how they have to communicate environment to a set of viewers. But the people doing it were the women in the Windward Avenue studio, and we've interviewed most of them and talked about where they came from. One had a graphic design background, but no real experience. She was a kid when she started working for them and started doing the layouts, you know, very low-tech, low-cost approach. And so that entire aesthetic obviously borrowed from other people in California, and also self-consciously positioned within a type of countercultural graphic vocabulary, but also slightly different, right? It doesn't look like the Whole Earth Catalog. It doesn't look like the kind of groovy graphics of San Francisco. It's something else, and trying to describe exactly what that graphic identity is, that's a task for one of you guys.
Yeah. I mean, it was just amazing, because I noticed they even had like a house font. They were using Cooper Black for everything.
Yeah.
That says a lot right there.
Really? What does it say? You have to tell me. What does Cooper Black say? All right.
So, thank you for the talk. I'll echo everybody else. I'm curious, like, you said that this was an underexamined practice. Like, I mean, are you kind of the first person to go and, like, dig into this? And I'm just wondering how many of these slides, like, as universities and so forth have digitized, like, have they survived over the years? I mean, clearly, like, you were able to pull a lot of this together through maybe the archives, but...
Have they survived with, well, you know, we had a fantasy, you know, this project is vast in the sense that it ties together so many different institutions and so many different sites. We originally thought we were going to map their entire distribution network. And what has survived are some of those, most of the sales invoices that I've showed, and that would assemble into a network of tens of thousands of institutions. And what has survived in those institutions, who knows? And you're probably aware that most universities have been scanning and disposing of slides for a long time, and because scanning is a long and arduous process, they often don't scan everything. They scan what they consider to be relevant. Who's making those decisions? We have no idea. So I have no way of guessing what has survived outside of their own collection. Not everything has survived in their collection. As you see, many of the slides have started to turn. It depends on which slide film they were using. It depends on how well they've been stored. Many have been stored in the condition that I showed you in a very humid and hot garage in Santa Monica, not ideal for image preservation, whereas some others have been stored in an office in Venice Beach, and those are the ones that tend to have done better. I don't know, does that answer the question?
Yeah, just curious.
I mean, but it's a fascinating problem, and it's all, part of the problem is what the slide is, and we were trying, as I insisted on, even though we have, I don't know if it's clear in this image, you can see at the end we have videos, and there are many more of these in Chicago, but we insisted on showing the slide image and its frame. So that meant we had to photograph it with light above and over an illuminated light table to see both, because we wanted to show that the slide wasn't, a disembodied image. The slide is, in fact, has material, chemical qualities, but also you can't really see here. Each one of these slides has handwriting on them as they're trying to figure out what the relationship is between series. So they become really fascinating sites of notation and inscription. And so part of that is to expose what all the different informational dimensions of the slides are. And luckily those have survived. Almost all of that first round of slides that were used for, to allow them to order the series have survived.
Just as the counterculture was co-opted and taken over by major corporations and mass media, is it possible that the same thing happened here? Could you talk about the relationship of the postmodern architects, especially Venturi and Graves and so forth? I mean, some of those images look like they could have been taken right out of the Venturi book. And it looks like a lot of so-called mainstream architects skipped the environmental bit and went straight for the money.
Well, I mean, that's a great question. In part, our interest in this project is that it sits at an important pivot point between the theories, the fantasies, the social practices of the 60s and what that meant for architecture and also for media practices. And what happens to architecture in the 70s. And so there are the ways in which media is described, the way it's incorporated into the discipline, into pedagogies, is crucial to a much larger institutional, disciplinary, political question. I totally agree. And there's no accident that their images look like the images from Learning from Las Vegas, because both these guys were looking at Ed Ruscha and John Baldessari, as were Venturi Scott Brown. So, they claim that those are Ed Ruscha street views of Las Vegas, and the EC group never recognizes their debt to Los Angeles conceptual photography, but it's very clear that that's what they're looking at. They claim that their imagery comes from film shoots in Los Angeles. What they're interested in is what the camera is seeing when the actors aren't acting, and so they have some notion of what the background city is. But so it's within a kind of complex construction, I agree, of what the everyday is versus the vernacular, let's say, and what the street is as a site of communication and social interaction. But Venturi Scott Brown, as much as they're invested in that in the late 60s and early 70s, I think by the time their architectural practice develops in other directions, I don't know, the sharpness of their relationship to media seems to fall away, even though they talk about pixelated facades and they talk about communicational surfaces. And that notion of communication seems to fall much more firmly within what became the signifying surfaces of architecture in the 70s, what historical reference was, how it could be appropriated and manipulated as an implicit disciplinary vocabulary. And so, let's say the surface of architecture and its forms is understood as a linguistic system, but maybe not as a mediatic system. And I think there's an interesting tension between the way in which language and linguistic theory is co-opted and semiology is co-opted by architecture versus media as it's co-opted by architecture. And I think there are really important fault lines there to work through, I agree.
I had one question, following up on Derek's question about the branding, which presented them as a fairly together business. But can you talk a little bit more about like what was happening behind in terms of a business? I mean, were they ever bringing in enough money based on these projects to be remotely self-sustaining, or what was the trajectory of them as a business model?
Well, I can tell you what they told me. We had an event at Columbia when we opened the show there, and David Greenberg came out, and David is somebody we know very well, and Roger, who now goes by Mona Webster, came out, and she had a lot to say about this, as did David, but the narrative goes something like this. David inherited $1 million, and they used that to start EC. By the end of EC's venture, that $1 million was gone. And whether that's because EC wasn't successful or they couldn't make it successful, 10 years. Whether they couldn't make it successful or whether that money went in other directions, whether it went, it's hard to know exactly what caused the bankruptcy. Because it did seem like they were relatively successful as a slide distribution business. They, as I've shown you, there are numerous records that prove that they did sell slides, and they and they hired people and paid them. But that's why, I mean, we try to work this out too, because it's not just that this is a business history. It's not just a story of how a countercultural group is somehow, seduced by easy money. That's not really it. There's something about how the business allows them a certain type of alibi of operation. It allows them a certain posture. It allows them a way into the institutions that they want to infiltrate. But I imagine it also gives them a structure for their daily life, because they were a group. They had to organize that group. They had to manage different personalities and many conflicts, which is why they have these perpetual group therapy sessions to try to figure out the conflicts among them. And so I think just the structure of the business was a way in which they could operate as a collective. And so there is a weird bleeding, but I don't think it's as simple as saying that they just were, seduced and co-opted. I think there's something about understanding a collective also as an administrative process is incredibly interesting.